Hello, welcome back. It's been a while. Today we're talking about Chapter 11, Section 3, Unity and Division. We only have two more sections for Chapter 11 before we get into Chapter 12, the Jacksonian era. But before then, we're going to look at this time between the War of 1812 and just following. And the clue from our central question for today is, what was so good about the era of good feelings? This whole time, everyone feels really good. They're really proud to be an American. So we're gonna look at this era, like the era of good feelings, and really what was so good about it. And some of our key terms for today are sectionalism, the American system, which we'll talk about, McCulloch versus Maryland, Gibbons versus Ogden, and then interstate commerce. So we'll be looking at some of the things that make this era good feelings, like talk about why, and then some of the specifically Gibbons versus Ogden, McCulloch versus Maryland, a couple Supreme Court decisions that really help to continue to define what the powers of the federal government were going to be. Remember, the country is only a couple of decades old, so we're still trying to figure out what power should the states have, what power should the federal government have, but we'll get into all of that in just a moment. Now, one thing that we will look at, especially at the beginning of this section, is a very important skill for studying history and, well, also for life in general, and that is the ability to recognize perspective. Now, I know we have practiced this in one way, shape, or form in previous lessons, but anytime we're studying history, because history is the story of people, it's important to try and figure out how a person's perspective is affected by his or her experiences, education, family, friends, the times they live, area, religion, and so on and so forth. Now, I used this picture. I took this a few years ago when I was living in Japan. And if you look all the way down in the corner here, you can see in the one mirror a little picture of a person standing. That's actually me taking a picture into this mirror. Now, these mirrors were on all the streets in Japan because the roads were very narrow and people would drive around corners and not be able to see what was coming around the next bend. Now, if I didn't have these mirrors to help my perspective, help my point of view, I might have gotten hit by a car, by another person on a bicycle, or hit somebody else. So it was good to have these so that I could help me to change my perspective. Now, during today's lesson, we're going to talk about three different men: John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster, and Henry Clay. Each of these men came from a different section of the country, and he defended issues that were important to that section. Each man fought for what was important to him, and specifically what was important to his home. Just like today, people fight for what is special, what is near and dear to their hearts. So how can we apply this today? Well, what about you? What are some of the things that you feel strongly about that maybe someone else that's from a different part of the country doesn't feel? And how do you think that your perspective is influenced by your surroundings, by where you grew up? So I want you to keep this in mind, keep this idea that we are Americans, but sometimes we tend to look at things from our own perspective, from the perspective of how we grew up and where. So keep that in mind as we go into our lesson today. So let's start today talking about this era of good feelings. And pictured here is President James Monroe. Now, following the War of 1812, some of the tensions that we had seen between the early political parties really decreased. We felt pretty good about ourselves coming out of the War of 1812. So Americans, they enjoy this. They have this new sense of unity, this new pride about being an American. And so there was a newspaper wrote that the country was in an era of good feelings. So when President Monroe ran for his second term in 1820, no one ran against him. The American public felt so good about his first term in office that no one really felt the need to challenge him. Now, we said this era of good feeling, it was first used in the Boston Columbian Sentinel, which was a newspaper in Boston, and this is an image from a poem about the 4th of July, and it was written on July 12, 1817, following a goodwill visit to Boston from then President James Monroe. And the era of good feelings is a term generally applied to describe the national mood of the United States from about 1815 to about 1825. So right after the War of 1812, for about the next 10 years or so. And it was, the country felt pretty good because there was a lower level of concern over potential foreign intervention on the North American continent. And there was a relative consensus. People relatively felt that domestic policy illustrated the lack of partisan factions. So to sum it all up, people weren't really afraid of other countries coming in and taking us over. And even within the country, like, a lot of the political factions just kind of dissolved and people generally just got along. Now, so here's a picture of a map of the election of 1820 that we alluded to a moment ago. So this is when the era of good feelings was really at its peak. And it shows that he was reelected with all but one electoral vote. And the only person that voted against him did so because of this concern that George Washington should remain as the only president that was elected unanimously. So he would have been reelected unanimously, but there was just one person that was like, you know what, that's a tradition that should be for George Washington only. So Monroe had been incredibly popular during his presidency, and he was the final U.S. president to have served in the United States Revolution. And following the War of 1812, we as Americans felt pretty good about the country's standing in the world. We were, like I said, like the political factions were kind of dissolving, and we were really coming together as a united group. And by this point, the Federalist Party had all but disappeared. So all those political conflicts of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson's time, that where people were getting so frustrated with each other and pushing for what they wanted, well, a lot of that had really ended. So our first video for today is going to talk about this era and how the country was really coming together following the War of 1812 and what would eventually lead us out of this era of good feelings.
As the election of 1816 approaches, many people in the North are impatient with the ongoing procession of Virginia presidents. But the Republicans have no trouble electing yet another Virginian in 1816. It isn't even much of a contest. James Monroe, former Secretary of State and Revolutionary War veteran, is 61 years old when he takes office.
After the Madisons left, just having started to build a rudimentary structure, Congress and the federal government enters into what we might call its adolescence. And like all adolescents, it's sort of gangly and uncontrolled and rebellious. And there was this sort of power push. There was this need for power, but no structure to contain it. So people are scrambling, men and women of political families are scrambling, trying to create power structures and coalitions and executive committees.
Monroe's cabinet includes both Federalists and Republicans from North and South, East and West. These years are characterized as the era of good feelings. There is little political opposition, at least on the surface.
Even in this early period in the United States, it's become clear that the office of Secretary of State, held by John Quincy Adams, was the stepping stone to the presidency. But other cabinet members were constantly jostling for position. And congressional committees are starting to form as well. And they also see themselves as kingmakers and power makers. So Congress in some ways had the powers to pick presidents because of the way the election system was structured. But of course, a president would have the ability to elevate someone from Congress to the cabinet where they could have a shot at being a president. So the big story for the Monroe administration, as far as I'm concerned, is this growing relationship, this I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, between the cabinet and the Congress.
Monroe is not a terribly bright man, but he's of course, the last of the great Virginia dynasty in the emerging old Republican tradition of a strict constructionist.
James Monroe was very committed to retaining this Republican vision of the presidency as a powerless office. In fact, one of the things we know about James Monroe, he was the last president to wear the old-fashioned clothes of the Revolution, the breeches and stockings, which even in his day was considered rather quaint. But it was his way of indicating through his clothing that he was trying actually to take the presidency backwards to this Republican vision.
Some of the 19th century's more prominent legislators argue for a more nationalistic approach.
I think Henry Clay in the 19th century has a blueprint, an economic vision that, although not entirely realized during his lifetime, is important in setting the terms at which the national debate over political economy will take place. And a vision that stresses internal improvements in order to create a domestic market that would link West and East firmly together, that would keep the Union together, that would create high enough tariffs to protect domestic industries in order to encourage the development of domestic industries. That Henry Clay's is a vision that in some senses is the vision that ultimately triumphs, that the United States does in fact develop an industrial base.
Now, on the surface, it looked like all of the struggles between the political leaders had really ended. I mean, like I said, the Federalist Party was all but done away with. So, and people were feeling really good about the direction the country was moving. And at this point, the Democratic Republicans were basically in charge of everything. But there were new disputes that were starting to bubble up that were based more on where people lived rather than where they stood politically. So it was more on the section of the country you came from versus your political affiliation. And in Congress, this was represented best in the struggles of three different men from three different regions of the country, one from the north, one from the south, and one from the west. So first up is this man, John C. Calhoun, representing the South. Grew up in South Carolina. He had grown up on a frontier farm and was from he was basically just an all-around tough guy. He was very strong, very bold when he spoke, and so much so that it kind of made people uncomfortable. He had personally supported the War of 1812, and like most Southerners, he was a very strong supporter of slavery. And generally, as a general statement, he agreed with policies that favored state governments over the federal government. And he disagreed with policies that would continue to strengthen the federal government. So to sum Calhoun up, he supported the War of 1812, supported slavery, stronger state governments, and a weak federal government. So that is John C. Calhoun representing the South. Next up is this man, Daniel Webster, who represented the North from New Hampshire. And actually, I have a friend named Daniel Webster, but he's from North Carolina, is not a congressman, and so that's neither here nor there. This Daniel Webster grew up in the North and was considered to be, at his time, the most skillful public speaker of his time. He was the kind of guy that once he started speaking, everyone would just shut up and listen. He was very eloquent, a very powerful voice, and I love this description of him. He was described as being a great cannon loaded to the lips. So he had a lot to say, but he was very good at getting his point across. Now, politically, he tended to fall in line with a lot of the other people that were from New England. He had opposed the War of 1812 and taxes to pay for the war effort because the war affected the northern shippers specifically. He wanted the federal government to take a larger role, especially in the economy, and he disagreed with Calhoun specifically on the issue of slavery. So, to sum up, Daniel Webster opposed the War of 1812, opposed slavery, and wanted a stronger federal government. I said that there were 3 sections being represented, the North and the South. So obviously the last one we're going to talk about is Henry Clay representing the West. Now, Clay's interesting because he'd been born in Virginia, but when he was 20, he moved to Kentucky. So he had this mix of being raised in the South, but also doing a lot of his activities in the West and growing up. He spoke specifically for the West and had been one of the most outspoken war hawks in favor of the War of 1812. He had a very strong personality and could be very charming one minute and a fighter the next. And he also favored the federal government taking a more active role in promoting the growth of the country. So there were some things that he favored that were more southern and some more northern. For instance, he sided more with the North on the issue that the federal government should take a more active role. And he was able to broker a deal between the northern and southern states over slavery called the Missouri Compromise, but we're going to talk about that later. So Henry Clay, the West, supported the War of 1812, supported a strong federal government, and was really kind of indifferent on slavery. It's like, yeah, if it works for you in the South, but in the West, not so much. So he was just kind of neither for nor against, just kind of indifferent. So kind of to sum it up, I want you to take a special look at this chart. And if you have your notebooks, you can jot this down right now. So we have our leaders, John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster, and Henry Clay. These sections that they represented, how they felt about the War of 1812, whether they supported it or opposed it. The federal government, it should be weaker or stronger. And slavery, supported it, opposed, or indifferent. So this growing sense of sectionalism, and that the people in Congress specifically were going to be representing their section of the country and what was best for their section versus what might be best for their party, is going to continue to affect the way the country grows, even to this day. When I cast my vote for my state senators and representatives, I want somebody that's going to represent my interests and represent the interests of what would be best for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So, I'm not going to elect somebody to represent Pennsylvania that is going to be pushing for the best things for, say, Utah. I want somebody that's going to be speaking for me. So this is neither good nor bad. This is something that is going to come back up in our discussions in the very near future. All right. So during this era of good feelings, people felt really good about how the country was growing, but there were new states, new territories being added, and people were pushing westward. So the country was growing physically, but financially, we were suffering. Initially, Jefferson and other Democratic Republicans opposed the idea of the national bank, but now we're starting to see that there was going to have to be some sort of federal bank to help spur on the economy. The money supply was running out, and even though the states were giving loans, they were putting too much money into circulation, which was starting to hurt the economy rather than helping it. So in 1816, the Second Bank of the United States was started, and the stability that it provided helped many American businesses to grow. So the Democratic Republicans, who were in favor of a very weak federal government, were very outspoken and opposed to the idea of a national bank. We're now seeing that there needs to be some sort of there needs to be something. The federal government doesn't have to be in charge of everything, but there needs to be some sort of national bank, and specifically a national currency as opposed to a state currencies. So in order to help the country to grow and to survive. Now, another problem that was facing the economy was foreign competition. There's still this question of Britain or France, Britain or France. Now, in the early 1800s with the Embargo Act, and especially during the War of 1812, American trade with Great Britain almost completely stopped. Now, without British goods in the market, American businesses were able to take control. But following the War of 1812, trade with Great Britain was restored. So now all of those goods just flooded back into the market. The Industrial Revolution had started first in Great Britain in the mid to late 1700s, so their factories were much older and were much more efficient, and more importantly, all of their factories had already been paid off, so they weren't paying mortgages and they weren't still paying for the buildings. Now, British merchants even went so far as to sell their cloth for less than it cost to make, hoping that they would be able to build a loyal customer base and drive some of the American merchants out of business. And the plan worked. It caused some businesses in New England to just go under, like, we can't compete with the low prices that are coming in. And so these owners were furious and demanded that Congress place a protective tariff on all foreign goods coming in. Now, we've talked about tariffs before, but as a refresher, a tariff is different from an embargo in that an embargo, no foreign goods are allowed in. But under a tariff, foreign goods can still come into the country, but there's a tax placed on them that will make similar products cost more. So, for instance, let's look at these two awesomely horrible jackets. Say you have, they're basically identical except for the color. Now, take these two jackets. Say one was made in New Jersey, one was made in Paris. Now, if they're completely identical, they should cost the same, right? Well, let's say that the brown one came from France. So if the brown one came over, it would have extra taxes placed on it so that it would be more expensive. And the idea is that it promotes goods made here in the United States. You can still get those foreign goods if you're willing to pay a little bit extra. Now, this is kind of what Congress was trying to do in 1816. The tariff of 1816 greatly increased the prices on foreign goods, and while this tended to help American manufacturers, it made a lot of Southerners angry because they were coming to depend on these British goods. Now, remember, most of the factories and most of the manufacturing took place in the North, so people in the South didn't see this as Congress trying to help the country. They saw it as Congress trying to help the North and showing favoritism to the North and neglecting the needs of the South. So an act of Congress that is meant to try and help the country ends up putting a strain on those divisions between the North and the South.
President John Quincy Adams was a firm believer in what was called the American system. This was a plan first instituted by Republicans in Congress in 1816. It required the federal government to take certain bold steps to make the United States a stronger nation. A key part of this plan was to have the government make important improvements in the nation's transportation system. One of these improvements was the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, seen here. When President John Quincy Adams broke ground for this canal on July 4, 1828, it was envisioned as a great national project that would increase the speed that materials could be transported between the Atlantic seaboard and the nation's interior. It connected Washington, D.C., and the great national road that began at Cumberland, Maryland, which at that time was the country's main route to the west. For many years, a steady stream of barge traffic, loaded with valuable cargoes such as grain and coal, moved up and down the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. However, by the time it was completed in 1850, the use of canals for transportation was already being supplanted by much faster steam-powered railroads, and the canal was rapidly becoming obsolete. The same year construction began on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, Congress took another bold step intended to promote the nation's well-being when it passed a very high tariff or tax on imported goods. The tariff was enacted to protect the factories of New England from overseas competition by making foreign products more expensive than their American counterparts. But the owners of southern slave plantations hated it. They called it the Tariff of Abominations, abomination being a word that means disgusting or loathsome. The reason they hated it was that a large percentage of southern agricultural products, mainly cotton, was sold overseas. In payment instead of money, they often received finished goods, such as woven cloth, and the tariff on these goods was a major expense. Southerners believed that the owners of northern factories were growing richer at their expense. They also thought that by imposing the tariff, the federal government was interfering with their rights. Besides that, many white Southerners were beginning to fear that the government might also try to outlaw slavery itself, and that was something they would not tolerate. And so, with the Tariff of Abominations tearing away at the fabric of national unity, another election was held in which Andrew Jackson soundly defeated John Quincy Adams for the job of President of the United States. And with that, a new era in American history began.
So these tariffs added fuel to what was a growing fire in American society and was helping to lead to the growth of sectionalism, which is loyalty to one's state or region of the country rather than to the country as a whole. If you're from the South, you identified yourself as a Southerner. From the North, Northerner. From the West, a Westerner. It was less of the, where are you from? Well, I'm an American, and more of a, I'm a Northerner, or I'm a Southerner. Now, back to Henry Clay, he tried to promote a system that would promote economic growth for all sections and to do so, he promoted what's known as his American system, which was based on high tariffs. So coming up, this will be a flow chart. So this chart kind of outlines Clay's American system. So it started, he proposed a protective tariff to get funding for transportation. So his system would benefit northern factories first, but he hoped that these northern merchants would start buying goods and equipment that were being created in the South and in the West, and would reduce the dependence on foreign goods. So northern factories would be promoted to start buying goods from the South and the West to be used in those factories and then sold back to the South and West. So the tariff money that was collected would be used to build better roads, bridges, and canals, which would, again, benefit the country as a whole rather than a particular section. Now, unfortunately, the government didn't do much to improve transportation while Clay was alive, but especially during the Civil War, the federal government really took the lead in trying to improve roads and railroads across the country. So Clay's American system, to break down policy, he proposed a protective tariff to get funding for transportation. Transportation improvements would include better roads and canals, and good transportation would lead to industrial growth. The South and West would cheaply transport raw materials to the North and the East for manufacture. Then these manufactured goods could then be shipped back to the South and to the West. So it made sense. It would take a lot of work and a lot of money, but this system, I can see how it would promote it would promote the country and benefit the country as a whole rather than one specific section. So the Supreme Court also got in on trying to improve the economic standing of the United States, and it promoted its growth through decisions that would expand the power of the federal government. So the first one we'll talk about is McCulloch versus Maryland. Now, the state of Maryland did not agree with the Second Bank of the United States. They didn't think that it was constitutional and didn't think that that was a power that the federal government should have. So the state tried to tax the bank in order to get it to leave the state. And James McCulloch refused to pay that tax. So in the Supreme Court, ultimately the decision went to the Supreme Court, McCulloch versus Maryland. The court ruled that the states had no rights to interfere with a federal program, and therefore federal programs took precedence over state programs. So this first video is going to outline the issues behind the Supreme Court decision, and then what the future implications would be from the decision of McCulloch versus Maryland.
One of the earlier cases that addressed the matter of federal rights versus state power was McCulloch versus Maryland. Two issues were at stake here.
The underlying issue in the case had to do with the power of the United States to charter a national bank.
Well, we go to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which enumerates the powers which the Constitution gives Congress. No place in that list of enumerated powers does it say explicitly that Congress has the power to charter a bank. I mean, it can raise an army and navy, can regulate commerce and this and that. It doesn't say it can charter a bank.
States, again, were trying to ensure that their citizens use state banknotes and use their own monetary system. And the national government creates the first bank of the United States. The goal there, one of the goals, was to eliminate all these various forms of currency.
And then a second issue in the case had to do with the power of the states to tax or regulate the operations of national banks within their state boundaries, if indeed there was to be a national bank.
In the end, the Supreme Court upheld the authority of Congress to establish a national bank. In so doing, it handed down one of the most important decisions in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court.
I would argue that McCulloch is the greatest case ever decided because Marshall takes the Constitution and talks about what are expressed powers, what are implied powers, and what those powers can be used for. And through his interpretation of what those powers are, he makes it clear that the national government's power can prevail over the state.
Today, the Congress establishes all sorts of corporations and involved with many things that are barely mentioned in the Constitution. But in those days, Congress had not previously established a corporation, and there's no enumerated power to establish a corporation.
Well, here's how the court resolved the case. Chief Justice Marshall decided that despite the fact that there's no specifically enumerated power of the national government to charter a bank, that such a power is nevertheless implied in the clause of the Constitution, which gives the national government those powers that are necessary and proper to the execution of the specifically or explicitly enumerated and delegated powers.
In his opinion, Chief Justice Marshall wrote,
"The power to tax involves the power to destroy. If the states may tax one instrument of the federal government, they may tax any and every other instrument. The mail, the mint, patent rights, judicial process. This was not intended by the American people. They did not design to make their government dependent on the states."
The great test of McCulloch is actually carved into the granite of the building, or the marble of the building. And what the opinion is the most beautifully written opinion you'll ever read.
So McCulloch against Maryland really strikes a major blow for federal against state power early on in our national history. It represents a decisive moment at which national power is expanded at the expense of the states. Now, that doesn't mean that state power is completely overridden, but certainly national power is expanded, and where national power expands, state power necessarily retracts.
I do often tell my students that if I was sent to a desert island and I could take one thing to read, I would take McCulloch versus Maryland, because it's all things for all times. The case talks about what power means, the relationship of power from the national government to the state, who has it, when they don't, what those limitations of powers are. And really the Constitution itself is all about power, the grants and limits of it. And McCulloch, to me, teaches that all by itself.
Now, there was a second case during this time that upheld the power of the federal government, and that is Gibbons versus Ogden. And this decision upheld the Supreme Court power that the federal government had power to regulate trade between states. So states could regulate their own trade, but as soon as it crossed state lines, the federal government could regulate that interstate commerce. So this second decision of Gibbons versus Ogden helped the national economy because it showed that the federal government could regulate trade between the states, and again promoted the federal government as being the be-all and end-all, being supreme over the state government. So keep that in mind as you watch this second video, and then I'll talk about our assignment in just a moment.
In 1824, the Supreme Court handed down a landmark decision that would further define the powers granted the federal government in the Constitution. The case was Gibbons versus Ogden.
The case of Gibbons versus Ogden raises the issue of what happens when a state law and a federal law conflict.
The question there was commercial shipping. Who had the authority to license and grant permits for shipping on waterways within the United States?
The state of New York awards a monopoly to anyone that could operate a steamboat up the Hudson River at 3 knots from New York to New Jersey. And Robert Fulton, the inventor of the steamboat, is the first to achieve this. And Ogden is the driver of the steamboat that wins this monopoly. Thomas Gibbons, on the other hand, is operating a steamboat under the Federal Licensing Act, in which he gets a piece of document from the federal government that allows him to operate in the very same waterways. So there's the beginning of the conflict of Gibbons versus Ogden.
At issue in this case was the scope of the Commerce Clause in the Constitution that gave Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes.
Well, typically of Marshall, he reads Article 1, Section 8, the ability to regulate commerce as broadly as possible. Marshall actually rules using the Supremacy Clause, arguing that when state law and federal law conflict, that the federal law should prevail, the higher law would prevail, and so that the states lose on those grounds.
Now, this creates a very interesting question of constitutional interpretation. It doesn't really look like a fair contest to let the national government decide a dispute between the states and the national government. It looks like the national government is serving as judge in its own case, contrary to a basic principle of procedural justice. But the matter stood, and so to this day, we have a set of relationships between the national government and the states that was established by these early cases.
So now that you're all done with today's lesson, I want you to move on to the questions on the next page. Now you're going to have 2 attempts on this quiz. So take your time, and like always, if you have questions, please come find me and I will do my best to answer them. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.